Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Debbie Rourke, and I'm the Executive Director for University Advancement and External Affairs here at University of Maine at Presque Isle. And on behalf of President Ray Rice, I want to extend his greetings. He's unable to attend today. He had to be on a business trip, headed south to do a conference presentation. But I am pleased to welcome everyone here today for this very special book reading by former University of Maine at Presque Isle President Donald Zillman. Today's event is especially significant as it brings to life for us the week-by-week experience of living through World War I. In addition to sharing this unique historical perspective, the presentation serves as a finale here at UMPI for our Constitution Day activities, as the war had a major impact on the American political system and constitutional law. You may have noticed the democracy wall at the foot of the stairs as you were coming up. And this week's focus was on the Constitution, so we're asking students to provide their input on whatever the question is on our democracy wall each week. This week it was on the Constitution. Former President Zillman is the Edward Godfrey Professor of Law at the University of Maine Law School. He spent several years working on Living the World War, which is a 2-volume study of the American experience in World War I. Completed with co-author Elizabeth Elsbach and comprising more than 1,200 pages, the books draw on reporting from the New York Times and daily debates in the U.S. Congress to show how events unfolded from the perspective of those who lived through them. Don is a prolific writer and editor. His writings include more than 50 articles and 15 books. In 2018 alone, with his co-authors, he published Living the World War Volume 2 with Van de Plas Publishing, Innovation in Energy Law and Technology with Oxford University Press, and the Maine Tort Law with LexisNexis. In his 25 years in Maine, he has served as the Dean of the Law School and, of course, as president here at this campus. He teaches military law, tort law, energy law, and advanced writing. That's a handful of things to teach. Away from the law school, he served this past year as the president of his Portland Rotary Club. He continues to be an active, competitive runner, and I've learned today that yesterday was his 915th race over 40 years that he participated in. So without further ado, let's give former Zillman a hearty county welcome home.
Bev, thank you so much. It is so delightful for Linda and myself to be here. I think it's been maybe 3 or 4 years since I've gotten up to Presque Isle, and I'm feeling very badly about that, and very happy to be welcomed home so wonderfully by so many of you. Just for no necessary coincidence, I was having the fun of rereading my diary from 2006, the year that I suddenly, the University of Presque Isle appeared on my radar screen, and in a period of about 2 months, I went from, gee, I vaguely remember visiting Presque Isle once to, oh my God, I'm the new president of the place, and circumstances that many of you know there. And I ran across this passage that I've shared with some of you on prior occasions of how absolutely special the county is. And that was, I think it was about this week in September of 2006. After, first few weeks on campus, I was downstate for some other business, including welcoming another new president into the folder that representing UMPI for that. And I said, it's probably going to get winter fairly soon up in the county, and I'm about to go out to LL Bean's and get some real good winter gear. And so in the delightful early morning of 24-hour open LL Bean store, I was one of maybe 2 customers in there, and 20 people on staff and all of the rest. And I did, first of all, some of my own scouting in the heavy outerwear kind of garb, checking out all the different comparators. And then I took, the 3 or 4 that this looks pretty close to what I want, up to one of the expert green-dressed LL Bean folks, and said, I'm looking for a jacket here, and give me some help on this. And I started probably getting a little bit picky sounding, and I said, well, this one is good to 30 below, this one says it's good to 40 below, this one has these kinds of sleeves that protect your wrists from getting wet, this one, blah, blah, blah. And I could see, very polite and very efficient, but at the same time, you could kind of see him saying, oh God, another aging yuppie from Connecticut. His LL Bean culture, oh boy, this, kind of big deal. And I detected that And with 5 words, I just turned the whole dynamic around. And I said to him, I'm wintering in the county. And his response was immediately, let me tell you why this one is a bit better for you. I went away with a marvelous jacket that I think I had for all of the time that I was up here. And also a marvelous sense of how respected and how strong a brand the county is. So that's a piece of the thrill of being back and seeing all of the marvelous new things that have been going on academically. The campus looks so much brighter, better put together. I understand it was a delightful welcome for the University Board of Trustees, and they went away, and some of them I'm hearing back down in Portland saying, that's one of the best trustees meetings we've ever had, organized, neat stuff happening. And then for several of them saying, and then I got a bag of potatoes to take home. It made the family's day, the original imports there. Well, World War I. What got us into it? And again, as mentioned, Elizabeth Elsbach, my co-author, and I'll tell you a little bit about Elizabeth in a bit. And then third participant, my editor, professional editor in her earlier life, my wife Linda, who had to go through all 1,200 pages of the 2 volumes thereof, which unfortunately we were supposed to have some shipped in, and they are not yet here. So if you are interested in a copy, or if you want to simply check some out, I've got some of my cards with the address on there. Just pop a message off there, leave a message with Debbie, and we'll make sure that you connect with them in one way or the other. And secondly, I also have, if the 1,200 pages is a little bit daunting, we managed to condense it down, and obviously this is just the guts of it, to about 20 pages in a Maine Law Review article out about 3 months ago. And that one I'll be happy, and I think I've still got it nicely there on email, to send out for free for anybody wanting, let me take that first look at it. So, the book, what's all this about? I'm really going all the way back to my Army days in the 1970s. Had kind of a fascination with World War I, doing some of the reading, and particularly as a lawyer, doing some of what was Congress doing as they wrote the statutes that governed the United States involvement in the war. And so that kind of got my interest going, and over time, and the time probably 25 years worth of note-taking and the rest, said, let me dig into the 2 sources that if you were alive in World War I and a reasonably educated American, you could have access to and follow what was happening in so many different fronts going on. And we came into this with a fun background, Elizabeth and myself. She was a student of mine, a marvelous student in class. Then we had a conversation one day, not focused on this, and she was telling me how much she was interested in World War I and from family and all of the rest. And we started lining up the likes and the unlikes of the 2 of us. And as I say, I'm a veteran, Elizabeth is not. I'm an American history major, Elizabeth is European history major, including studies overseas for a year in the Balkans, where you get a little bit of World War I still out there. I am probably off a year or 2 as a baby boomer. She is a millennial. My family is more male than female. Hers is much more female than male. And so with all of those contrasts, we said it would be marvelous to see how both of us would take a look at much of the same material and what observations we would come away with. And our agreement was that either one could pretty much write their section of it as they wanted, and the other could critique it but not exclude it. And after we were done with that, we discovered there was almost none of it that we wanted to knock out. And I certainly would have picked up some of the things she would have if I first started, and kaboom, so there we are. Our assumption on the book, and I'm thinking about it now, probably some of this is drawn from my own diary writing. Let's do it week by week. And rather than, here's the entire war, and now let's gulp, and we'll focus on submarine warfare, or we'll focus on food rationing, whatever it may be. We'll say this week of September 22 to 28 of 1916, or 17 and 18, or whatever, here's what happened. And we will go on the premise that you don't know what happened next. And that's a very changing approach to your history. And you're saying, we're all very smart after the fact, and a lot of the World War I kind of after the fact. was, well, we fought it, but then that was a stupid war because along came Adolf Hitler and we had to do it all over again and even more bloody than the first time around in Rome. Well, he didn't know that at the time, and lots of things could have changed that. So that's how we scripted it. And I suppose by comparison, I'm thinking maybe this is, we'll sit down and write the next one at some appropriate point. What fun it would be now to be gathering the same sort of information, probably from more sources, because the communication is so much broader than it was, than in the two sources we had in 1917-18 of the New York Times, probably the eminent newspaper of its time and becoming ever more so in the war, and the Congressional Record, the debates of the House, Senate on the House floor and the Senate floor, talking about war kinds of issues. And so my fascination today would be, I would love to do the same thing that would be called living the Trump administration. And every time we thought, boy, this can't get any more confusing or crazy or fascinating, it does. And just starting this morning, oh my goodness, would you believe what happened now over the weekend? Kinds of things there. So there we are. Let us put the war in, and this is just my rough piece of it, 4 periods. And we'll walk those through, and very different things, very different takeaways from each of the 4 periods. And then we can jump into, let's do the reading portion here, where we'll take our present 100 years ago this week, September 22 to 28, 1918. What was going on in all of the different things in the country. And then we'll come back to what are some of the large lessons to be drawn from this, and particularly what are some of those large lessons for today. And things that were very relevant then are very relevant today, as I hope you'll agree with me. So, our 4 periods of war. Number 1, we start October 1st, 1916, late days of a presidential election. Woodrow Wilson, the incumbent president, going up for re-election against an eminent Republican opponent, Charles Evans Hughes, former governor of New York, former academic in law, former practitioner, and former justice of the United States Supreme Court. Wow, what a potent pair. And they ran a very close election, not decided really until 3 days after Election Day was over, as they did a final count in California, and Wilson wins. Wilson wins in considerable part on the slogan that he, not so much he as others in the campaign adopted, he kept us out of war. World War I, which had been going since August of 1914, the news certainly reporting to any reading American, reading or even gossiping American, of just an incredibly bloody war. And if you remember some of the Civil War kind of stuff, as the war broke out, what's the perception? And everybody is saying, we'll whip those Yankees and whatever, we'll whip those rebels in 2 days and we'll come marching back, have a big parade, and yay, there we are. Anybody that had that view of what World War I had been about in 1916 fall was just delusional. The catastrophes had been horrible. The new weapons of war were immensely destructive. And we discovered the 2 primary killers of soldiers out there were not individual riflemen or individual bayonet wearers. They were artillery and machine gun. And you take probably 80% of the fatalities, and it's about equal amount of casualties wounded out there, were from those 2 sources. So there was the Wilson kept us out of war, and he wins the re-election. He certainly is wanting to stick to that promise, but unfortunately the Germans, for good, smart, or dumb reason, and you can agree and historians agree, disagree on that, didn't let it happen. And 2 big pieces came in to shift the American attitude from probably support Wilson, let's stay out of this war. And incidentally, the United States can make a whole lot of money by selling munitions, goods, food, anything else over there, as these countries are desperately needing them, and will run them almost bankrupt buying our goods. And the industries just absolutely love it. Well, the 2 things that change that dynamic and then suddenly push us into war in early April 1917. First of all, Germany, after battling back and forth diplomatically with Woodrow Wilson, goes back to unlimited submarine warfare, which is their major naval weapon, against the British and to a lesser extent French blockades, surface ships will keep anybody from bringing goods into Germany, and Germany is suddenly running short of all kinds of things. The Kaiser, the others in the German military establishment say, we need to stop any kind of shipments in there, and if this means we have to go back to, quote, unlimited submarine warfare, if we see somebody out there that looks like they are headed for a bad purpose to Germany, we can sink them. And recalling the Lusitania sinking, a big mobilization in America in 1915 over that. And essentially, it's back to Lusitania rules of the game. Whoa, Americans suddenly ready to break relations as they do with Germany, get very on a war footing status, and then a month later, it gets even worse for the German point of view. When released to the American public through the British, and the British obviously with an interest, let's get the United States in on our side of the war, sends what's known as the Zimmerman, not Zillman, Zimmerman telegram to the United States. And the Zimmerman telegram is essentially diplomatic communications between Germany and Mexico through their ambassador to Mexico. And the bottom line of the Zimmerman telegram is, if we should be going to war with the United States, we would urge Mexico to come in on the side of Germany, and while you're at it, persuade your friends in Japan to bring Japan in on the side of Germany as well. And incidentally, and this probably, if they needed any more concluding, this did it for the American people. And the Zimmerman telegram concludes, and in thanks for your service, we are delighted to give you back the lost territories of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, which were taken from Mexico at some point in the 1840s or 1830s. And that pretty much kept it. America, at least the majority of America, ready to go to war. War is declared. President Wilson, impassioned speech, and 4 days later, a good debate there. Congress supports the move to war. And interestingly enough, in the Congress of the United States, there are 56 no votes, and various different reasons why 6 senators, 50 representatives voted no on this, but it was by no means a unanimous or virtually unanimous as World War II was. Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, and is there any reason we could possibly not go to war? No, says any senator representative wanting the slightest chance of being reelected. This one a good deal more controversial. That's period one. Period two, roughly April 17th, right after the declaration of war, onward to about November or late October of 1917. That's the high performance period of the 65th Congress of the United States. And they, in remarkable debate, remarkable difference of opinion, but settling the difference of opinion, and some remarkable law writing, does all of the following things. And you think of these today, well, that's sort of standard congressional business, isn't it? By no means necessary. And as I say, we start the first one as we declare war on Germany, and recall at the time, most everybody said Germany is the strongest military nation, certainly on land, in the world. And lest one think, oh, there are other things than just how many soldiers you've got out there. There is Germany that also has a fascinating statistic, how the country is ranking. How do they do in Nobel Prizes in the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, medicine, compared to other countries? And looking for a period of about 30 years, which have been covering when most of the scientists that got the awards were doing their work right around the World War I period, your total count was American, United States, 5 Nobel Prizes in those fields. Britain, about 18 prizes in those fields. Germany, 33. And so this is how you fight a modern technological scientific warfare, and we're going up against the first team by anybody's estimate from that. So there is, we declare war. Second thing, very quickly done afterwards, the Allies are needing money, among other things, to pay off the American goods that they are bringing in, and the United States Congress goes racing through a $3 billion with another $2 billion, and this is billion in the days that was sort of what trillion is become now, award, we will provide loans to the Allies in this amount of money. And the debate on that was remarkably small. And you have this marvelous sense of reading over conservative Republican members from many of the states that would now be regarded as good red states saying, I don't care if they pay it back. And that's the shorthand. They've suffered, their people dying, their economy hurt for 2+ years fighting this war while we've been on the sidelines. And that's the least we can do at this point, is to help give them some money. That point 2. Third of the matters out there, create an army. And again, the United States, we think of the United States Army, you know, huge, best in the world, everything else. Back then, it was not much. We had not fought a major mobilization since the Civil War. And we had certainly had lots of, minor wars, fighting, chasing native tribes off their proper land, the war with Spain and the rest. But the United States was by no means a military power. Certainly on land, somewhat on sea, but by no means up to what Great Britain was. And the great debate that went on, and this was one of the most controversial debates of the Congress. Do we do this in our traditional focus of seeking volunteers? Everybody sign up, the war wants to go fight the war, great, you're in, we've got enough of an army, we go. The military establishment and a good part of the government, and finally persuading President Wilson, we need to go to a military draft. Conscription, every young male between, and they eventually settle on 21 and 30, is obligated under penalty of jail prosecution to serve if called on to serve. And we set up a structure in the selected service boards of how we are going to gather this army together, and we pass that piece of legislation, and very quickly thereafter start the mechanism running. We are doing, here's the draft drawing day, here's what we're putting together for the Army, here's who makes the decisions in a very civilian focused, rather than we just turn this over to military generals and colonels to decide who serves. And there's a fascinating chunk that doesn't get much discussion in sort of the alternative universe. Suppose this hadn't worked out. And I have to suspect that every supporter of the draft law and every member of a draft board getting ready to administer it was saying, what happens if we put the order out to all sorts of people and they just don't show up? And suddenly you're sitting there with, we've got 500,000 people who should have reported under penalty of criminal felony, and they didn't do it. Can we possibly prosecute 500,000 people and keep this system going? What's the message for the rest of the world out there? What's the message for the country? And you had your fingers crossed quietly while being probably optimistic this is going to happen, and of course it is, it's in the law. And kind of the neat statement from one of the draftees, unidentified at the time, was, yeah, I went down and I did it, everybody was doing it. And yes, there were some who didn't, but they were a very small minority of the population. And recognizing that with those 56 legislators who had voted against the declaration of war, and in many cases voted against military conscription, the draft, they certainly would have had some support in there, I am not going to go, I am not going to serve, etc. So we set up that military structure there. Next to the ones, and again, very controversial when we got down to it, how do we raise the further money beyond that first loan to the Allies that's going to be needed to fight this war? And two big choices out there, and the solution, which one do we use? We use both. Taxes and selling bonds. And selling bonds, and as you hear, is one of the great cover photos of a James Montgomery flag poster encouraging people to buy war bonds. Citizens go out, put $25, $50, $500 if you're down. We'll give you the bonds. The bonds are payable back in 30 years. At that time, there will be a different population, a larger population, to help pay them off, versus the taxes. We're taking that money right now. And the taxes was also a time when the great majority of federal government dollars to support government was not from income tax or other taxes. It was tariffs. I mean, tariffs, we've heard that recently, and this is goods coming into the country and they have to pay a certain fee, and that fee goes to the government, and that's enough to support the government activity. And the major kinds of taxation activities were the matters of state and local government. We will property tax, we possibly will income tax there, and suddenly all that changes in the World War I Tax Act and several modifications of Tax Acts. And as again, one of the Representatives said, we are doing something that nobody likes, being taxed. What are we doing? On everything we can possibly find to tax. And you go down these long lists of what things, theater tickets, yes, we'll tax those. We'll tax that, we'll tax that. We'll particularly tax personal income. And at a time when the income tax was still new constitutionally, and then in about its 5th year, and in the last version before the war came in, the estimate was 1% of the United States population had to worry about paying an income tax. They were the 1% of the time, making a lot of money. Sure, we'll go after them, and they may not have liked it terribly well. But for the rest of the population, this income tax means nothing to me. Suddenly, you're down to, if your income is in, the $1,000 range, you're going to have a whack of income tax there. And oh my goodness, suddenly everybody is in play. And you add on to that all of the goods, services, taxes that are there. And the average citizen is suddenly saying, Uncle Sam is coming and taking tax money out of my pocket in all sorts of different ways. And the Congress of the United States says, yes, that's the only way we're going to pay for what we are needing to do here. And if taxation wasn't enough to get you rankled up as a citizen, or at least certain kinds of citizen, the next line of stuff is maybe more. Regulation of activities normally left to the workings of either the free market, private economy. What do you want to buy? It depends what you want to sell, and we decide that for ourselves, and that's not government telling us that. Here we have government getting in, and we'll just pick probably the 3 big ones. Government involved in food, government involved in transportation, government involved in fuel, coal, oil, gas, other pieces there. And again, government, and they appoint leaders of the national effort to say, what are the rules of the game here? What are we going to forbid under congressional approval? And we are doing all sorts of things. Shutting down any number of passenger trains around the country. Holding out food from various sources. Sitting around in the, what were referred to as the czars running the different enterprises, one of whom was Herbert Hoover, later to be President of the United States. There is the food czar, and here would come down all of these orders from Hoover. Here's what you think you should be serving during the week. No meat on Wednesday, no meat on Friday, no such and such at the restaurant if you're going out. And your life is being regulated by these people. Should they be able to do that? Well, they were certainly going ahead and doing that. So there's that last piece. And then one more of a long list of statutes that, well in the book. Some very dangerous, from a First Amendment perspective, restrictions on criticism of war. And the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918, gets government in the business of making felony criminal prosecutions, talking 20 years in jail for violation of this, by acts that are critical of the war effort. And it's one thing to say we should be able to punish at law a spy. Here's somebody who comes in and they get some information on this is when this troop ship is sailing, and we ship that over to Germany and bad things happen. Yeah, that's not supposed to take place, and yes, maybe that's speech. I'm talking to a German agent or something. But others of them cut much more closely to, here is objection to the war. I don't like it because of the following things. Or I think we ought to take a different view of this. And suddenly there are prosecutors around, not just people who disagree with your views, let's have a hot conversation about this. So put all of those together, that's one portion of one session of Congress. And we can disagree with some of the things they did, but you certainly cannot question their dedication to the cause. And we talk about, here are things that, what are the burdens on Congress as they've sent soldiers over there and they're fighting as best they can. Probably the best judgment of that is taking a look at the end of this 2-year congressional session. 10 members of the Senate died in office. 15 members of the House of Representatives died in office. And that was probably a greater kill ratio than most of the military units that the American government sent over to fight. And that's not to diss those units, but simply to reflect. This was a pretty powerful sacrifice in a lot of different places that were there. That's the second of our pieces. We're now to November 1917, running roughly to maybe August of 1918. Things get bad. In the first segment, we're saying war vigorously declared, lots of good legislation out there, things like the draft, moving ahead, and then suddenly things not necessarily going so bad, or going so well. And in our period 3, November 17, June 18, you had any number of days that you would be looking at the overall picture from what's in your newspaper in the morning and saying, my God, we may be losing this. And why would we be losing this? Number one of the first and major allies there was Russia. And in 1917, through 2 revolutions, Russia went through, we get rid of the Tsar. That's generally good news. Autocratic, we don't like that. We're democracies, France, Britain, and the United States fighting. The Tsar is out of there. We think we have a liberal Russian, or United States, British equivalent of that. And then in late fall, October, November, depending your calendar at the time, in come the Bolsheviks. And Lenin and Trotsky are in there, and their 3-word slogan, peace, land, and bread. We do not want to be fighting this war anymore. We want a fairer distribution of the land there, and we want to make sure there's more food out there. And suddenly Russia has dropped out of the war, or Russia has pretty much let the Germans continue to win the war over there until finally the Germans say we've got to have a peace and we will give up a good chunk of our territory to have that happen. An obvious consequence of that is then you have freed the German East Front army to come to the Western Front, and suddenly the Allies are outnumbered fairly dangerously. Second, you had some, even before that, just exhaustion on the part of Britain and France, the 2 major Western allies fighting the war up to that time. And their French undergoing genuine mutinies there, the English with some considerable doubt of, are we fighting this war sensibly? And so that's where we sit, maybe November 17, as the very first American troops start arriving in country. Third piece of that are the Allies coordinate, answer no. And there's a lot of impact on how you're fighting the war between do the parties get along, France, Britain, United States primarily, and the answer coming back, not much. Submarines, again, the submarines still a threat to survival of England if the submarines are doing the job that they potentially could do. Last, or 2 really remaining ones, doubts in government and start being some pretty disagreeable congressional debate. I don't think we are running the war properly. We should be in it, it's not take us out of the war, but the Wilson administration is not doing a good job. And there you're into some pretty nasty controversy that comes running along. And last piece that we throw in, that winter of 1917, 1918, absolutely horrid weather. And you had your headlines from the New York papers, similar to most of the papers Midwest and farther, dipping into the South, but certainly New England and New York and New Jersey and the rest of Pennsylvania. Snowfall shuts down trains. Coal can't be shipped so that people are using it for their essential fuels there. We are running out of other things that we should be having. We've got to shut schools down because we can't afford to heat them, and everything looks like it's going off track. Oh, wow. That runs us through, then we get back to 1918, and the Germans put forward really 5 separate attacks that come dangerously close to winning the war on the Western Front. And ideally, the Allies and the Americans, as they're building their force, are just able to hold them back from winning the war. And then the news starts getting good as we move toward Armistice Day with stunning certainty, as we're here in the sort of August to November of 1918. The Americans arriving just in time, and there were literally some battles there where it looked like the French and the British army had just about collapsed, and there was not much stopping the Germans from cruising on to take over Paris, and at that point probably put the French out of the war, and in came just enough American forces that they were able to hold the Germans back, and then turn things around. And then in pretty good succession, the German collapse of their military force went forward faster than the Allied, particularly French-British, collapse of their forces. And with the Americans coming on, the message, and one of the lovely quotes that I have General Pershing, the American commander, first shows up in France in July of 1917 with a small group of troops, not enough to win a battle. But people were here admiring General Pershing, looking like a great general, is exactly what we want. And one anonymous, according to the Times, anonymous Frenchman said, yes, and behind him there are 10 million more. And that's the personnel difference, and the Germans assuredly knew it. And that suddenly pressed things very quickly to a 1918, November 11th, at the 11th hour, armistice that eventually was a German surrender, although Germans would like to have claimed afterwards that it wasn't. But that was the end of combat activities in the war. And then slip into all of that, what else was happening in that period of summer to fall and a bit beyond in 1918? Totally unrelated to the military. The Spanish influenza, which killed more people around the world than the combat in the war. And you tend to forget that that's there, and then you are thinking of, wow, what a time to have struggled your way through as the pieces are out there. And I think probably, I can't imagine how tough it would have been to have been a drafty GI on one of these ships taking maybe 10 days to go over the rough seas to get you to France. And, oh, by the way, you know, a third of your crew are down with the flu on the ship. And do I jump overboard now, or do I wait to die, or do I hope all things will turn out well? But tough times as we work through those pieces that are there. Well, other things going on in the time, and I'll get to the reading in just a minute. Number one, even if we had not been fighting a war, what other big issues were up there? One, race relations, and we think of Black Lives Matter and other movements today. God, where was the rest of this going then? And we can talk about some of the pieces that were out there. Secondly, two significant constitutional amendments working their way through the congressional process, 18th and 19th, and anybody remember which was which or which they were about? 19th Amendment, the later one to get through, did what?
Women's suffrage.
Yes, Me Too movement of today, the equivalent then, women's suffrage. Should women have the right to vote? As a matter of national declaration. Before then, individual states could give them the right to run, but it was not all over the country. This is the rule of the game, and that one goes. And that one just barely missed passing the Congress in the 65th session. Then it went through in the 66th, and we were off in that piece, at least, of women's equality settled. The other, the 18th?
Prohibition?
Yeah, prohibition. What do we do with alcohol in the country? Where does that fit into war plans? And a fascinating difference of opinion in parts of the country and just political attitudes. And you would have on the one side, the argument would be, we need to stop drinking. This is an unproductive, inefficient, non-scientific habit, and it does all kinds of havoc to what we want to do and why we were fighting the war. The other side, and with lots of, including Henry Cabot Lodge, you would not think of as a wild radical of any kind, saying this is absolutely stupid. People like to drink. Let them have their drink. They'll be more efficient workers. We're keeping some eye on them, don't get too drunk out there. Oh, and incidentally, we probably would lose about $500 million in federal tax on legal alcohol. Ooh, let me rethink this matter, they would say. So there was that, and the last one that we often forget, just from the timing, is the reunion of the North and South. The Civil War ended in 1865. The combat part of it ended. The Reconstruction era ended roughly in 1877. Consequences of the war are still going on, and which is to say, lots of members of certainly the older portion of the population, both North and South, had strong memories, in many cases were veterans. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court was a Confederate veteran from Louisiana, and numbers of other legislators in the same capacity. And the idea that somehow we all peacefully came back together again and the great America went rolling on, that's a real stretch for anybody who studies civil wars in the Balkans or any place else. You have memories that are eternal and some matters never clear themselves out. And frankly, one of the better studies of the whole thing said the summary of the reunion process was essentially white Northerners and white Southerners ganged up against blacks and said blacks are the ones who are going to get screwed in this. We will bring the South back to something resembling its prior power, give them certainly a significant role in the legislature, and there we track on from that. Other pieces of the thing, and we'll shortly get to the section of the reading here. The things that impress me particularly about this period, and it was assuredly not a perfect period, lots of terrible stuff going on, lots of things that we now think about, oh, I can't imagine they were doing that, I can't imagine they were saying that in the halls of Congress. Still, here was a Congress that was working in considerable bipartisan fashion to enact all of this war legislation, to work with, occasionally oppose, President Wilson in how he was carrying out the policy in all of these new areas. And wow, that's fairly impressive. And as I say, the casualty toll in Congress was a pretty high one. And much of that, I think, considerably to overwork. And the long vacations that would usually be there, and the early adjournment hours and everything else. And the legislature was saying, I've now got the choice of whether I should go to the crucial committee hearing, whether I should be there on the floor because Congress is voting on it, or possibly I should be off helping to raise money for the war bond. Every one of those a hugely virtuous activity. I can't do them all. And you know, where do I make my choices on that? Second piece of it, and I certainly hinted at some of this already, how stunning the average citizen's involvement in the war would have been. And you think some of the things that we were talking about, how does any of what we have talked about impact? Well, we start with the weather. Here was some of the most horrific weather that we can. Lots of services that you expect as a regular thing may not be there. We can't get the coal in. The trains are not running. We've canceled service. We've canceled what you were able to eat and how you can do that. Wow, I don't like that, or that has some real impact on me. Second, the taxation. Oh my goodness, I'm suddenly paying the federal government a good chunk for what goes on here. At the same time, I'm being encouraged to go out and buy a bond, or 2, or 3, or 4, and put some of your money in there, and we'll pay you that back 20 years, 30 years from now. And the feeling is if you aren't doing that, you're less than a good American. And in some cases, that being pretty pushily enforced by some of your neighbors who may have been doing the same thing, probably were. But wow, that's a piece of what I'm expected to do as well. The flu, and lastly, the widespread military service. The draft tapping, chances are, of the American population, maybe 110, maybe 115 million, I would guess the substantial majority of those either had a member of the family, son, father, other, a co-worker, a good friend, colleague, fellow Rotarian, whatever it may be, in service. And that was a considerable part of life. And you look at some of the casualty lists, and the fascinating one, and I invite everybody to offer me your equivalent today. Who would be the serving in the military person that would match these descriptions? The immediately removed mayor, stepped down, elected out, mayor of New York City, or any other of the largest American states. Secondly, a longtime, very influential member of the House of Representatives. Third piece, a popular poet, also happening to work for the New York Times from time to time. And you probably don't, I'll see if the name reflects. Joyce Kilmer. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. Anybody heard that? That was popular verse 1917, and probably you would have had 70% of the American people saying, yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, good stuff there. And then I will throw in maybe the top athlete of the year. And this would have been in college, the professional sports. Yes, there is baseball, but not much else. And here, that would have been. And lastly, a son of a president of the United States. Putting the 1917-18 names on all of these: John Mitchell, former mayor of New York City; Joyce Kilmer, our poet, New York Times author; Augustus Gardner, Representative Augustus Gardner, the 20-year plus strong advocate for military preparedness; Hobie Baker, our hockey player extraordinary, and the College Hockey Award still named after him. The Hobie Baker Award is the best you can do as a college hockey player. And lastly, Quentin Roosevelt, the youngest son of President Teddy Roosevelt. And I'm trying to imagine who the equivalent of those would have been if that same, we're tapping into the American population very heavily, and we hope reasonably non-discriminatory. This doesn't let the 1% or the 5% off with one excuse or the other. They're either by volunteer or the draft expected to be in there. And all of those mentioned died. Some hospital, others military service. Quentin Roosevelt went down air combat. That kind of classic, this is World War I fighting at its probably most appealing, to the extent there is anything appealing about people getting killed in war. These are the folks combating the other planes, and they're up there and they're shooting each other down, and only the best will survive, sort of thing. Last, let's take a look at that week, 1918, and some reading from the book. September 22 to 28, 1918. The one paragraph summary. The Spanish flu took on even greater seriousness for both American armed forces and the American people in general. Allied advances in Europe continued to raise prospects for an Allied victory in the summer or fall of 1919, still a year away. However, continuing chaos in Russia, the Bolshevik takeover, remained a wild card in international relations. The next Liberty Loan campaign was about to begin. Congress continued to debate revenue generation, prohibition, and women's suffrage as members shifted their attention to the midterm elections coming up very shortly, about as shortly as ours here. First, subhead, the Spanish flu. Sunday Times continued a confident view toward the flu epidemic with the headline, quote, "Malady the flu, not dangerous unless neglected." In a world lacking medical education, the prospect of neglect was very serious, however. The Surgeon General article on advice for avoiding respiratory diseases included: number 6, open windows; 2 or 11, avoid tight clothes; 12, when the air is pure, breathe all of it you can. Very helpful. Monday's Times reported Franklin D. Roosevelt, then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, continued to recover from his bout with the flu. By Friday, the flu was reported in the Times front page with the headline, "Influenza stops flow to the camps of drafted men." It was so serious. And the particular target of this flu was men 20 to 40 years of age. Unlike what you usually think of this as senior citizens or very, very young people. This is a early middle age kind of threat. Advances on the Western Front. Sunday's Times lead story reports, Hoover asks us to tighten belts to beat Germany. Food administrators stressed, save food, save food, save food. That doesn't force us to put as much on transports. We can send more troops on the transport that we have. Second front page Times article reported the Chief of Staff of the Army estimated American forces overseas, now total, and most of them in Europe, totaled 1,750,000. The American presence grown strongly and was a major part of the fighting that would take place. Colleges around the country opened their academic year with all male students in Student Army Training Corps uniforms. This is a part of the combination of draft and volunteer stuff. Much of the academic year was expected to be devoted to military training. We are wanting to produce, in particular the college's case, more officers, but also more enlisted personnel as well. The devastating cost of the war in human terms was captured in a front page headline, Iowa Regiment lost half its strength in 8 days. This is 8 days of bitter trench combat there in France and Belgium. And the 168th Infantry Regiment of the famed Rainbow Division lost 1,460 officers and men, about 50% of its strength. And those are casualty figures that you can compare with Civil War, with World War II, any of the wars that we have been fighting, and they are way above that. And it is just startling. And you think, fortunately for America, the great portion of their wartime casualties fell within about a 2-month period, right there at the end, August, September, and then maybe pushing into October and November, the armistice comes around. And imagine if the United States had been in the war since fall of 1914, what the casualty level might have been. The Liberty Loan Drive, the fourth Liberty Loan started, it was 1 way away from starting. Sunday Times artists reported famous artists were designing the Liberty Loan posters, as shown there. Charles Dana Gibson, eminent artist, led the pictorial publicity division of the campaign. One vivid poster, and I haven't seen it, and I would like to get it, had New York City under shell fire with the Statue of Liberty crumbling. Airmen, weapons, shoot down the Statue of Liberty. Congress's work, last piece here, Representative Kahn opposes the Temperance Amendment. He fears narcotics might be the replacement for alcohol. You know, you could do worse than alcohol, kind of thing. And also the matter of there's the revenue that comes into government there. And the Times article continues, Representative Kahn noted that George Washington had run a distillery. If it's good enough for George Washington, it should be good enough for us by now. Senate's session of Thursday takes up joint resolution for the women's suffrage amendment. And the debate turns into a significantly racially driven debate. One of the Mississippi senators offers the amendment to grant suffrage to white women only. And recall this was after the 15th Amendment had granted suffrage to both male blacks and whites that were there. Comments in there get stunningly racist by contemporary terms. Senator from Mississippi mentions, quote, the overshadowing race problem which falls like a blight of poisonous dew. He urged white male actors to, quote, eliminate the Negro as a race from politics by law. White women's suffrage would help that grant, but the senator also feared if you're giving black women the vote, they're likely to be more difficult, more obnoxious than the black men. And so on the halls of Congress, debate going, and with much of the congressional record, the ability to have changed that after you saw that was how it came out. And I imagine if somebody had said that incautiously today, they immediately would have been rushing their staffer down, trying to take that quote out. I didn't, I misspoke, and this is why that's exactly what I said, and that's exactly what I meant. That's the state of matters there. So, open for questions, comments, reactions. Any pieces of what we have got.
The quote that you spoke of when Pershing entered, was that a bluff?
No, I think that was the average French citizen's reasonable estimate. If the United States needed to bring 10 million draftees, volunteers.
So they actually thought that was, the French thought that was coming and wasn't?
Probably a combination of thought and hope.
Oh, okay.
And thought was, let's do some serious calculating of what's there. Some of the debate in Congress, if we would be needing that many, we could do that.
Yeah.
And it was, as it turned out, that was what turned the war.
Conscription, the selective service. Did they make that up out of whole cloth? What was the precedent? It hadn't been done before, so I mean, where did it come from?
Yeah, yes it had, in the Civil War particularly.
Okay.
And the Civil War, particularly the northern side of conscription, was this just nasty writing things in, such that if you don't want to go, you can buy a substitute. Get enough money, you can buy a substitute. And that, okay, this looks like the privilege they're taking care of and others are not. And New York City rioted at the time that the draft was going in and the draft gathering being done. And overall, the total estimate was the draftee portion of the Union Army, somewhat greater for the Confederate, was a maybe 5% to 6%, and they were by and large not terribly good soldiers. So it was a volunteer war, and that was the model that the supporters of let's keep the volunteer army there wanted.
What was the real region for World War I?
Oh my, that's about
That's a miracle.
six courses of lectures and the rest. And it's interesting, I think my perspective on this changed somewhat. The sort of, maybe probably commonly accepted. We had an assassination of an archduke, I remember about an archduke, somewhere in the Balkans. The Balkans is kind of crazy land. And suddenly everybody felt they were allied with somebody else and they had to declare war. If Russia declared war, we come in, and then boom, 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 boom. And it was all terribly stupid why we got into it. There were a lot more significant issues going at the time, and there were a lot more plausible reasons of who was afraid of what. And we can probably take 3 quick looks. Germany, very troubled. We've got bad guys on both sides of us. Here are the Russians and the other Serbs out to the east of us. Here's Britain and France, we think, out to the west of us. And we're sort of outnumbered, and if they want to come after us, we've got some trouble. The French worried German, in addition to their militarization, their population growth was just outdoing Germany, or outdoing France rather badly. And the French are saying, wow, we can come down to it, and we're going to be outnumbered considerably. And the Germans are probably better fighters than we were. And the British, much of, can we continue to rule the oceans, which we regard as one of our strengths there, if other countries start building up their navies, and Germany particularly in that. And as I look even at the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, he is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and Austria-Hungary at the time, a major world power, and solid evidence supporting to this day that this was a plot of the Serbian government to assassinate him. And I'm saying, what would, whatever our political views are, and I suspect we're all over the board currently, what would be our reaction if we were suddenly seeing a foreign power had come in and advanced and carried out the execution of Vice President Pence? And suddenly, Vice President Pence assassinated. Where did this come from? It looks like, oh, these are one of the countries, fill in the blank, that we are having serious trouble with. Would we be ready to say, yeah, that's all politics happening, we don't have to go to war with that? So, tricky stuff. Yes, you would like to have seen it done differently, but much of that is only in retrospect. We saw what happened there. And the most interesting, I think, if you had said the United States had not come into the war, would the Allied parties and the Central Powers just have so exhausted themselves by probably 1917 that they would have said, we have got to come to some kind of peace agreement, and nobody is going to be the big winner in this, and we want some concessions from you, but you're giving some concessions to us. And you would then gone away from that on both sides, saying, oh my goodness, what a horrible waste of lives for no purpose. And maybe that would have put war off the agenda forever. If that would have been, I selfishly would have said, I'll sacrifice those souls back then for a much better world today. But tricky stuff.
As a native Texan, I'd like to know the Mexicans' response to that Zimmerman note or memo that the Germans sent.
They were pretty clear. The first piece of the response, aided by the Germans and the German-American supporters here, was that's obviously a forgery. This is the British intelligence trying to stimulate something, and don't believe a word of what's there. And that lasted maybe with some effectiveness for about 3 or 4 days. And then Foreign Minister Zimmerman says, no, that was nothing we wrote. But it was just a strategic plan, cautionary planning kind of thing. If for some reason Iceland were to declare war on us, what would we do? And we probably got a plan for that is out there, but we don't mean it and it's not going to happen. The Mexican response, pretty strongly, no, we do not endorse this. And the Japanese response, even stronger, no, we do not. This is an outrage. And it was, okay, that there that one sat.
Since there was a draft then, so all the ones that were non-American, they were volunteers for World War I?
For the American side,
Yeah, right.
yeah, we would have, and the combination was, we had a regular army that has been there forever, and that was about 200,000 at the start of the war. And those were people, I'm in for a 30-year career, and this is where I'll spend my life. You had the National Guard units in each state. And those were, much of your focus as National Guard is taking care of local problems. If we have a miners' strike in our state, you're maybe getting called on. Nowadays, if you've got a weather disaster, you're going to be the ones who are called out to help. But with the ability to be called up to federal service, and those were called in. And then the others were some combination of volunteer, pure volunteer, and the draft. And the draft, clearly a major portion of that army that we put together.
And the Navy, right?
The Navy, much less volunteers. Some draftees in there, but the Navy and also the other reluctant to take draftees at any point, our old friend the Marines. Every Marine is, I want to be a Marine. No, I was drafted and they put me in the Marines. But the Army is the major portion that used that. And last fascinating piece of raising the Army, who was one of the great advocates for a volunteer force, at least to some extent? Teddy Roosevelt. And there was Teddy Roosevelt as of the United States, and he had been urging the United States to get into the war, I think, at least since the Lusitania Scene. And Teddy gets his wish, we go to war. And there is Teddy with his memories of, I headed up San Juan Hill, and you know, the greatest moment of my life was that. Here was Teddy saying, I want, and going around to the leaders of government, including the president, let me raise a division or several of volunteers. I will lead them. I will get good leadership with them. They will be like the Rough Riders of San Juan Hill. And we can get them over ready to fight to inspire Europe far faster than any of your draftee armies. And in a tough decision, both the military establishment and the congressional leaders and the president eventually say, no, Teddy Roosevelt volunteers. And so poor Teddy and one or two others of similar things were running around afterwards, thinking back to 1916 and saying, the motto was, he kept us, he Wilson kept us out of war. Meaning me, Teddy, when I passionately wanted to go to war. And every indication is this was not a political posturing kind of thing. I want to go off and lead the troops. Yeah, right, you do. Tell me about it. This was Teddy very, very distressed that he didn't get to do it. And then living the war through his sons and two others besides Quentin, badly wounded, Quentin killed, and a lot of the speculation is Teddy, who at the Armistice Day, if you had asked who's going to be the Republican nominee for president in 1920, Teddy would have been head and shoulders over anybody else in the Republican Party. And that was after being 12 years out of office, going through all sorts of interesting stuff. So many wonderful characters in here, and you pick up little tidbits of the things that are going on. Yeah.
By the way, if you're looking for posters, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston just a few years ago had a fantastic exhibition of posters from those wars, and you probably could contact them, and they could probably get a copy of the poster that you
See
want.
if we can get that. Thank you. Thank you.
What did you see on prejudice against German citizens in the United States? I've been looking at a man who appears to have been a hobo, and he was imprisoned for 5 months as a German spy. And I wondered about the legality as well as how widespread were things like this.
Yeah, it's tough and it varies. Obviously, got in my own home state of Wisconsin, heavy German population. Robert LaFollette, their senior senator, strongly opposed to declaration of war, strongly opposed to lots of the war measures, but eventually supporting it. There, I think, we recognize a considerable portion of German population. They are good folks, and there probably was a considerable pressure on the Germans to show what a good American you are. And I suspect if I were selling bonds in Wisconsin, I would have been very eager to go out to every German family that I could and say, you can't make a better statement of your support for Uncle Sam than buying a $50 bond. Oh, I don't think I want to do that. And suddenly, let me write down that name there, and I'll pass it on to some others, and your life may get a bit more unpleasant. Other states, some fairly nasty abuses of German citizens. Some of it sensible, others not. On balance, it's probably not the most horrific treatment of enemy aliens that has been around, but war is not a terribly good time for civil liberties, as we know, and that's why we need civil liberties. We push things. Any other? Deb, I turn it back to you.
Well, I just want to close by thanking Dawn for coming to the county and visiting with us, and going away gift for you.
Oh, my goodness, thank you.
And the appropriate blue bills, of course.
Sure.
Oh, you have to, right? There's a couple little things inside. Can you tell us, are you starting to retire? Are you preparing to do that yet?
I have got one more year of promised teaching at the law school after this year. And then we are trying to figure out what next comes. And yeah, what next pieces are out there. And Linda and I are working that out as we go. And very possibly, living the Trump administration. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you might have it.
Wow. I know what this is. UMPI. Hey.
So you can wear it.
I mean, that's all right. I may put this on. And the second piece is,
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then when you're not quite sure what you want to be doing with your time, have you seen these before? They're called fidget spinners, right? So a lot of people in this room know what they are. You just spin them and ponder what you're going to do next.
I like it.
Yes.
I like it.
So I really want to say thank you so much to Dawn and Linda for coming up and joining us today. It was really a special treat for all of us.
Thank you all so much for the welcome back to the county.
And we do have, on the back table, there's a tablet of paper. As he mentioned, the books did not arrive in time. If you would like to put your name and an email address on that sheet of paper, we'll be able to send you an email with a link to Amazon. He's left his business cards as well on the back table. We'll put the 2 books back there for you to look at, but don't take them away. He needs them.
They're my only copies.
They're his only copies. And I just also wanted to pull your attention to, if you put your name and email address on that back sheet, we'll be sure that you start to receive through emails our cultural arts calendar. And there are some on the table outside. We have various speakers coming in this fall, including one this week. He's an anthropologist. He's from Harvard. We have speakers coming in to talk about agriculture. We have comedians, hypnotists. The UMPI band will be playing later this year. So there are all kinds of events on campus, and we encourage you to come out and enjoy those. Also, this weekend is homecoming, so come on out and visit with us over homecoming. We'd love to see you. Please enjoy the coffee. There are some cookies, desserts, water. Take some time to socialize with one another and enjoy each other's company, and we look forward to seeing you again at another event coming up.
Thank you.